Nothing from the outer periphery had ever mattered to anyone who lived within its borders. Culluth knew this better than most because it was his job to watch the periphery, to sit inside the cold metal walls of Argus VII, a deep space monitoring station that floated at the edge of civilized space like a forgotten lighthouse, and to stare at sensor screens that almost never showed anything worth reporting. He was a Valetha, tall and thin with 6 limbs folded neatly against his torso as he leaned forward over his console, his pale silver eyes scanning lines of data that scrolled endlessly across the display. It was the most boring job in the entire Imperium. The outer periphery was a wasteland of primitive civilizations, species that still burned fossil fuels and fought wars over patches of dirt on their tiny worlds, and the Imperium had long ago decided that none of them were worth the effort of contact or conquest. So Culluth watched, and logged and watched some more, and every shift was the same as the last, a long stretch of nothing followed by a longer stretch of more nothing. Until today. The sensor ping came in at the 14th hour of his shift, a small blip on the edge of his screen that he almost dismissed as background radiation or a stray asteroid tumbling through the void. But then it moved. Culluth sat up strutta and pulled the data closer, expanding the scan with a flick of his upper right hand. The object was traveling at a velocity that made no sense for anything originating from the periphery, cutting through open space at speeds that only mid-tier Imperium vessels could match, and it was accelerating. He ran the silhouette against the Imperial Recognition Database, a system that contained the energy signatures and hull profiles of every known species across 400 civilizations. No match. He ran it again. No match. He ran it a third time, this time expanding the search to include decommissioned vessels, experimental prototypes, pirate modifications, and even theoretical ship designs that had never been built. Nothing. The object was completely unknown. Culluth felt a strange tightness in his chest that he had not felt in years, something that took him a moment to recognize as unease. He flagged the contact as a Class 0 unknown, the rarest designation in the Imperial Kettlelagung system, one that had not been used in over 2 centuries. Protocol said to monitor, log, and forward the report to the nearest military outpost for review at their convenience. But the object did not behave like something that could wait for a convenient review. It crossed the periphery border and entered Imperium sovereign space without slowing down, without transmitting any identification signal, without responding to any of the automated hailing frequencies that Argus VII broadcast in 1,200 different languages. Culluth watched it come, his 6 hands now gripping the edges of his console so tightly that the metal groaned under his fingers. He opened a priority channel to the nearest fleet command, which was the fortress world of Nathara in the Midrim, and he spoke the words that would set everything in motion. This is Argus VII. I am declaring a Class 0 incursion, single vessel, unknown origin, unknown capability, currently on a direct heading into sovereign space and ignoring all contact attempts. The response came back faster than he expected, not from a communications officer, but from the Fleet Admiral himself. Fleet Admiral Suthron Kull was old even by Valetha standards, a decorated warrior who had crushed rebellions and border skirmishes across 3 centuries of service, and he had never once encountered something from the periphery that warranted more than a dismissive wave of his hand. His voice came through the channel like gravel scraping against stone, heavy and unimpressed. One ship, Sensor Va. Yes, Admiral, one ship, but its speed and energy signature do not match anything in our. One ship, the Admiral repeated, and Culluth could hear the contempt dripping from every syllable. From the periphery, you woke me for one ship from the periphery. Admiral, its trajectory. Send me the trajectory. Culluth transmitted the projected course, and for a moment the channel went silent. When the Admiral spoke again, his voice was different, not afraid exactly, but stripped of its earlier amusement. The trajectory was a straight line, a perfect unwavering line that cut through 12 Imperial defense sectors without a single deviation, aimed like an arrow fired from the edge of the galaxy directly at the Throne Nebula, the sacred heart of the Imperium where the Emperor himself resided on the throne world. That is either the most suicidal or the most arrogant thing I have ever seen, the Admiral said quietly. He mobilized a patrol squadron within the hour, 40 cruisers from the Nathara garrison, each one bristling with enough weaponry to crack a small moon, and he sent them racing to intercept the unknown vessel at the edge of the third defense sector. It was, in his mind, an absurd overreaction to a single contact from the periphery, but the trajectory had unsettled something deep inside him that he refused to name. The 40 cruisers arrived at the intercept point and spread into a standard encirclement formation, their weapons charged, their shields raised, their crews tense with the excitement of an engagement that most of them expected to last less than a minute. And then the unknown vessel dropped out of its acceleration and came to a full stop. It hung in the void before them, alone against 40 warships, and every sensor operator in the squadron reported the same thing at the same time. The vessel was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was not elegant like Valatha ships, which were built to reflect the grandeur of the Imperium with sweeping curves and golden hulls. It was not organic like the living vessels of the Kavatha or the crystalline structures of the Nathari. It was brutal, angular and dark, covered in thick plates of armor that looked like they had been welded on by hands that cared nothing for beauty and everything for survival, studded with weapon systems that the Valatha sensors could not fully identify, radiating an energy signature that pulsed like a heartbeat. It looked like something born from a world that had tried very hard to kill everything on it, and had failed. The squadron commander, Praetor Nuthas Alun, opened a channel and broadcast the standard Imperial demand for surrender in High Valatha, then in Trade Common, then in 6 other major languages. Silence. She repeated the demand. Silence. She was about to order a warning shot when the unknown vessel transmitted a signal of its own, broadcast on an open frequency in broken Valatha tradespeak. The words awkward and mispronounced but perfectly clear in their meaning. We are the warship UESS Achilles, representing the United Earth Stellar Navy. We are not here to negotiate, move aside, or be moved. Praetor Nuthas stared at her display for a long moment, her mandibles clicking in disbelief. She had never heard of Earth. She had never heard of humans. She had certainly never been threatened by a single ship, surrounded by 40 of the Imperium's finest cruisers. She almost laughed. Back on Argus VII, Kuluth Va listened to the transmission with every one of his 6 hands pressed flat against his console, and he felt that tightness in his chest again, stronger now, spreading through his body like ice water in his veins. He did not know what a human was. He did not know what the UESS Achilles was. But he knew, with a certainty that he could not explain and could not shake, that the galaxy had just changed forever, and that nothing the Imperium did next would be enough to change it back. Praetor Nuthas Alun had earned her rank by never hesitating, and she did not hesitate now. The lone vessel before her had been given its chance to surrender, and it had chosen defiance, so she gave the order with the calm confidence of someone who had never lost a battle and could not imagine a universe in which she would. All ships fire at will. 40 Valatha cruisers opened up with everything they had, plasma lances and graviton torpedoes and particle beams, a wall of destructive energy that lit up the void like a second sun, enough concentrated firepower to reduce a small planet to molten slag. The barrage struck the human ship dead center. And nothing happened. The sensors showed impact after impact, energy readings spiking off the charts, but the vessel designated UESS Achilles did not break, did not buckle, did not even drift from its position. Something surrounded it, a shimmering field of energy that the Valuta targeting systems could not classify. A barrier that seemed to drink in the plasma fire and scatter the graviton torpedoes like rain hitting a stone wall. Nethys felt the first cold finger of doubt touch the back of her mind, but she pushed it away and ordered a second volley. The second volley never landed. The Achilles moved. It did not move like any ship Nethys had ever seen, not the slow, graceful turns of Valuta warships or the predictable attack runs of border raiders. It moved like a predator, like something alive and furious, accelerating so hard and so fast that the Valuta tracking systems lost lock for a full 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all it needed. The first Valuta cruiser died before its crew even understood what had happened, struck by a projectile so small and so fast that the sensors registered it only as a brief streak of light before the ship split in half and vented its atmosphere into the void. The second and third cruisers died together, hit by the same weapon, 2 streaks of light that punched through their hulls from bow to stern and left them as hollow burning shells tumbling end over end. Inside the Achilles, Captain Idris Mwangi stood at the center of the bridge with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the tactical display with dark, steady eyes that showed nothing of what he felt. He was a tall man with deep brown skin and close-cropped silver hair, broad across the shoulders in the way that people from the East African Federation tended to be, and he carried himself with the quiet weight of someone who had made a terrible decision and intended to see it through to the end. "Kinetic rounds are effective," reported Lieutenant Asha Reeves from the tactical station, her fingers dancing across her console with a speed that bordered on inhuman. "Their armor has no answer for relativistic impact, switching to pattern delta for the next wave." "Confirmed," Mwangi said, and his voice was as calm as still water. Reeves was young, barely 26, with sharp features and dark hair pulled back tight, and her eyes burned with a focus that made the older crew members uneasy, because it reminded them too much of themselves when they were young and still believed that skill alone could keep them alive. The Achilles tore through the Valuta formation like a blade through silk. It did not fight the way the Valuta expected, standing at range and trading volleys like civilized warships. It fought dirty and fast and close, diving into the gaps between enemy ships where their weapons could not track it without risking friendly fire, deploying swarms of autonomous drones that latched onto hulls and burned through armor with focused plasma cutters, broadcasting electronic warfare signals that turned the Valuta communication network into a screaming mess of static and false contacts. 9 minutes after the first shot was fired, 32 of the 40 Valuta cruisers were either destroyed or drifting dead in space with their systems fried, and their crews scrambling for emergency shelters. The remaining 8 broke formation and ran. Praetor Nethys sat in the command chair of her flagship, which was listing badly to one side with half its systems offline and fires burning on 3 decks, and she stared at her tactical display with an expression that had gone far beyond shock into something that looked almost like religious terror. She had just watched 40 warships of the Valuta Imperium get dismantled in less time than it took to eat a meal, by a single ship, from a species she had never heard of, from a region of space that the Imperium considered a wasteland of primitives. As the Achilles passed her crippled flagship without firing another shot, a new transmission came through, and this time it was not in broken trade speak but in perfect High Valuta, the formal language of the imperial court, spoken with a precision that meant it had been prepared long in advance. "We have no quarrel with your crews. Render aid to your wounded. Do not follow us." And then the Achilles was gone, accelerating back onto its original course, that same straight, unwavering line aimed at the heart of the Imperium, leaving behind a field of debris and burning metal, and a praetor who could not stop her hands from shaking. The battle report reached Fleet Admiral Sothran Kale on Nethara within the hour, and he read it 3 times because the first 2 times his mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. 40 cruisers engaged, 32 destroyed or disabled. Enemy casualties, 0 confirmed kills. Duration of engagement, 9 minutes. He set the report down on his desk and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall of his office where the battle honors of the 3rd Vanguard Fleet hung in golden frames, victories stretching back centuries. And for the first time in his long career, he felt something that he had only ever seen in the eyes of enemies he had defeated. Fear. He mobilized the entire 3rd Vanguard Fleet, every warship under his command, 2,000 vessels of war pulled from garrisons and patrol routes across the midrim, and he sent an emergency dispatch to the Throne Nebula itself, a message marked with the highest priority classification the Imperium possessed. Single hostile vessel of unknown origin has engaged and defeated a 40-ship patrol squadron in under 10 minutes with no apparent damage sustained. Vessel is continuing on direct course for the Imperial Core. Request immediate reinforcement and authorization to deploy strategic weapons. This is not a drill. He sent the message, and then he sat back down and tried to imagine what kind of species could build a ship like that. A ship that fought with such terrible efficiency, such calculated precision, such absolute refusal to stop. Aboard the Achilles, the bridge crew worked in focused silence, repairing minor systems and updating their tactical databases with everything they had learned about Velithi weapons and defenses. Captain Mwangi left the bridge in the hands of his executive officer and walked alone to his quarters, a small cabin deep in the heart of the ship, where the hum of the engines was a constant vibration in the walls and floor. He sat at his desk and opened his personal log, a habit he had maintained since his first deployment 20 years ago, and he spoke quietly into the recorder. First contact with Imperial forces went as predicted. Their weapons are powerful, but their tactics are rigid, and their electronic warfare capabilities are almost non-existent by our standards. Casualties on our side. 0 casualties on theirs. Significant but minimized where possible. He paused and closed his eyes. 3 years ago, Earth sent 12 ships and 6,000 people to the Velithi Imperium as a diplomatic envoy. They carried gifts, cultural exchanges, scientific proposals, and a message of peace from every nation on our planet. They entered Imperium space broadcasting friendship on every frequency. His voice dropped lower. They were never heard from again. For 3 years we searched, we begged, we sent messages that were ignored, we pleaded with every species we could contact for information. And then 6 months ago, an anonymous data package arrived at our deep space relay station, containing Imperial military logs that showed exactly what happened to our envoy. He opened his eyes, and they were hard as iron. They were destroyed on sight, by direct order of the Emperor, because the Imperium decided that humans were too dangerous to be allowed into the galactic community. 6,000 men and women and children killed, not because they did anything wrong, but because something about us frightened an empire that has ruled for 12,000 years. He straightened in his chair. The UESS Achilles is not here to start a war. We are here to finish a silence. They erased our people and expected us to never find out. They were wrong. And now we are coming. And we will not stop until the entire galaxy knows what was done in the dark. He closed the log and sat alone in the quiet hum of his ship, as it carried him deeper into the territory of an empire that had made the worst mistake in its long and terrible history. It had assumed that silence meant surrender. It had never met humans before. Deep beneath the surface of the throne world, in a vast library carved from black stone that stretched for kilometers in every direction, Archivist Tilun Kas sat surrounded by data crystals and holographic displays, and tried to understand what a human was. He was not a soldier or a politician. He was a keeper of records, a quiet and careful Velithi with thin limbs and pale eyes that had spent more time reading than they had ever spent looking at the sky. And when the Imperial Intelligence Bureau had contacted him with an urgent request to compile everything the Imperium knew about a species called humanity from a world called Earth, he had expected the task to take no more than an afternoon. He had been wrong. The records were scattered, fragments buried in periphery survey reports that no one had read in decades, footnotes in xenobiological databases that had been filed under low priority and forgotten. And the more Tilun found, the more he wished he had not gone looking. Humans came from a world that the Imperium's classification system designated as a Class 12 death world, which was the highest danger rating available before a planet was simply declared uninhabitable. Their homeworld had extreme axial tilt that created violent seasonal shifts, tectonic plates that constantly ground against each other producing earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, an atmosphere that carried storms powerful enough to flatten cities, oceans that covered most of the surface and generated waves tall enough to swallow ships, and a biosphere so aggressively competitive that nearly every living thing on the planet had evolved some mechanism for killing other living things. The humans themselves were persistence predators, a classification so rare in the galaxy that most xenobiologists considered it theoretical, a species that hunted not by being faster or stronger than their prey, but by simply never stopping, by chasing their targets across open ground for hours and days until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, and the humans walked up to it and killed it with tools they had made with their own hands. They were not the strongest species on their world, not the fastest, not the most armored, not the most venomous, and yet they had risen to absolute dominance over every other form of life on their planet through a combination of endurance and adaptability, and a relentless creative intelligence that turned every obstacle into a tool and every setback into a lesson. They had survived ice ages and plagues and famines and floods, and they had done something that no other known Deathworld species had ever accomplished. They had built a civilization, not just once but dozens of times, and when those civilizations fell they built new ones on the ruins, over and over, refusing to stay down, refusing to accept that anything was final. And they waged war, not as a last resort, not as a failure of diplomacy, but as an art form refined over 10,000 years of continuous practice, with strategies and tactics and weapons that evolved at a pace that made the Imperium's own military development look glacial by comparison. Tilun sat back in his chair and stared at the data with all 6 of his hands pressed flat against the desk and tried to process what he was reading. These were the beings that the Imperium had classified as too dangerous to integrate. These were the beings whose diplomatic envoy had been destroyed on sight. He pulled up the sealed Imperial record that the Intelligence Bureau had reluctantly provided him, and he read the order that had condemned 6,000 humans to death. It bore the personal seal of His Eternal Radiance, Emperor Valeth XXII. The reasoning was clinical and cold. Preliminary analysis indicated that humanity's rate of technological advancement, combined with their deathworld physiology and their cultural tolerance for violence, made them a long-term existential threat to imperial stability. Therefore, the diplomatic envoy was to be intercepted and eliminated before formal contact could be established, and all records of the encounter were to be sealed at the highest classification level. No trial, no warning, no communication. Just silence and death. Tilun's hands were trembling as he closed the file, and he understood now with terrible clarity why a single human warship was burning a path through the most powerful empire in the galaxy. Because someone had sent the humans those sealed records. Someone inside the Imperium had leaked the truth, and now the humans knew exactly what had been done to their people. And they had come for an answer. Far from the quiet archives of the throne world, the Achilles was approaching the Vaynar corridor. the only navigable hyperspace lane that led from the midrim to the inner sanctum, a narrow passage through a region of collapsed stars and gravitational anomalies that acted as a natural choke point, the single door through which anything or anyone had to pass to reach the Imperial core. Fleet Admiral Sothran Kale had placed his entire fleet across that door. 2,000 warships hung in formation across the mouth of the corridor, arranged in layered defensive lines that stretched across thousands of kilometers of space, the largest military deployment the Imperium had authorized in over 300 years. Sothran stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Imperial dreadnought Sovereign Will, and watched the lone human vessel approach on his tactical display with an expression that had aged him 10 years in the past 2 days. He opened a channel. "Unknown vessel, this is Fleet Admiral Sothran Kale of the Velithi 3rd Vanguard Fleet. You are ordered to cut engines and surrender your ship and crew. You will be processed humanely under Imperial military law. This is your final warning." The response came immediately, and it was not words but action. The Achilles accelerated. It came screaming out of open space and into the mouth of the Vanar corridor like a bullet fired into a hallway, and the battle of the Vanar corridor began. The first Velithi line opened fire with a coordinated barrage that would have obliterated a fleet, but the Achilles did not fly into the barrage. It flew around it, diving beneath the plane of the formation and using the corridor's own gravitational distortions as cover, slingshotting around dead stars and collapsed space to appear at angles that the Velithi targeting systems were not designed to track. The ship deployed drone swarms by the hundreds, autonomous machines that screamed through the Velithi formation, broadcasting false sensor signatures and electronic interference that turned the carefully coordinated fleet into a confused mass of ships firing at shadows. And then the Achilles struck at the command ships. It did not waste its weapons on the line vessels. It drove straight for the flagships and command carriers, the nodes that held the fleet together, and it hit them with relativistic kinetic rounds that punched through the heaviest armor the Imperium could build. The Velithi fleet was not incompetent. They were the finest military force in the galaxy, and they adapted, closing ranks, adjusting tactics, pressing the Achilles from every direction, and they landed hits, real hits, that tore through the human ship's hull and opened decks to the vacuum of space. But the Achilles did not stop. Hours passed, 1 hour, then 3, then 7, then 10, and still the battle raged inside the narrow confines of the corridor, the human ship bleeding and burning but still fighting, still pushing forward, still refusing to die. Lieutenant Asha Reeves saw the gap at the 14-hour mark, a momentary weakness in the Velithi formation where 3 command ships had been destroyed in rapid succession, and the remaining vessels had not yet reorganized, and she proposed a maneuver so reckless that the ship's navigation AI flagged it as a 93% probability of total destruction. Captain Mwangi approved it without hesitation. The Achilles dove into the gravitational eddy of a collapsed star, riding the edge of an energy current that should have ripped the ship apart, and it used that current like a slingshot to hurl itself completely over the Velithi formation and out the other side of the corridor. The maneuver that would later be called the Reeves Gambit worked. The Achilles emerged from the Vanar corridor broken and bleeding, with half its weapons offline and entire sections of hull missing. But it was through. It was past the blockade, and there was nothing between it and the Throne Nebula but open space. Behind it, 600 Velithi warships drifted as wreckage among the stars. Admiral Sothran stood on his damaged bridge and stared at the empty corridor ahead, and understood that the thing he had feared most had come to pass. He opened a channel to the Throne Nebula, and spoke one sentence in a voice that sounded like it belonged to a man who had already died. "It is through, gods forgive us, it is through." And deep beneath the throne world, Archivist Tilun Kas finished his report and carried it to the imperial court on shaking legs, knowing that the truths he held in his hands were about to collide with 12,000 years of lies. Above the throne world, ancient machines that had not stirred in millennia began to wake, planetary defense systems so old that most citizens believed they were myths. And the sky above the capital city, filled with a light that no living Velithi had ever seen before. The Imperium was afraid. And the Achilles was still coming. The Achilles was dying. Captain Idris Mwangi knew this the way a parent knows when a child is sick, not from the damage reports that scrolled endlessly across his cracked displays, or from the alarms that screamed through corridors filled with smoke and sparking wires, but from the feel of the ship beneath his feet, the subtle change in the vibration of the engines, the way the deck plates groaned when the vessel changed course. The thousand small sounds that told a captain who truly knew his ship that it was holding itself together through nothing but stubbornness and failing welds. Of the 1,200 crew members who had departed Earth aboard the Achilles, 613 were still alive. The rest had died in the Vaynar corridor, killed by hull breaches and explosive decompression, and the terrible kinetic force of Velithi weapons punching through armor that had been designed to withstand anything the galaxy could throw at it, but had never been tested against 2,000 warships at once. The survivors worked in silence, patching what could be patched and sealing what could not, moving through the wounded ship like blood cells trying to keep a dying body alive for just a few more hours. Minerva, the ship's artificial intelligence, spoke to Mwangi in the quiet, precise voice that he had come to rely on more than any human advisor over the past weeks. Captain, I have completed my analysis of our remaining combat capability. Primary weapons are at 31%, secondary weapons at 12%. Shield generators are operating on backup power only. Engine output is at 44%. And hull integrity across the forward sections is holding but will not survive another sustained engagement. What are our odds of reaching the throne world? Mwangi asked. Based on current intelligence regarding the Imperial Home Guard and planetary defense systems, I calculate a 4.7% chance of reaching the surface intact. Mwangi looked at the tactical display where the throne nebula glowed like a vast cloud of golden light, beautiful and terrible, the sacred heart of an empire that had ruled 400 species for 12,000 years. That is 4.7% more than zero, he said. The Achilles entered the throne nebula and was immediately met by the Home Guard. 5,000 warships, the most advanced the Imperium had ever built, crewed not by ordinary soldiers but by the warrior priests of the Velithi elite, beings who had trained since birth for the single purpose of defending the throne world, who considered death in its defense to be the highest honor any Velithi could achieve. Behind the fleet hung orbital defense platforms the size of small moons, bristling with weapons that could crack continents, and behind those, the throne world itself glowed with the activated light of surface batteries that had not been fired since before most civilizations in the Imperium had achieved spaceflight. It was the most concentrated display of military power in the history of the galaxy, assembled to destroy one ship. And then something happened that no one in the Imperial command structure had anticipated. The Nethari, an insected species that had been conquered and absorbed into the Imperium 8,000 years ago, and forced to serve as maintenance workers aboard the orbital defense platforms, began shutting down systems from the inside. It started with a single platform, its weapons going dark and its shields dropping without explanation, and then a second platform followed, and then a third, and the Velithi commanders suddenly found gaps appearing in their defensive grid that should not have existed. Across the fleet, Korvathi gunners aboard Velithi warships, conscripted soldiers from a reptilian species that had been pressed into military service generations ago, refused to fire when the order came, sitting at their weapons stations with their clawed hands folded and their yellow eyes staring straight ahead in silent defiance. The Imperium had spent 12,000 years conquering and subjugating species across the galaxy, forcing them into service, breaking their cultures and bending their wills, and it had never considered the possibility that all of those conquered peoples were watching the Achilles come and seeing something they had never dared to imagine. One ship from one species, standing alone against the full might of the Imperium and refusing to stop. It was not a military strategy. It was a symbol, and symbols are more dangerous than any weapon because they cannot be killed with guns. The chaos spread like fire through dry grass, not an organized rebellion but something worse. 1,000 small acts of defiance and hesitation and sabotage that disrupted the perfect coordination the home guard depended on, opening cracks in the wall of ships that the Achilles was small enough and fast enough to exploit. Minerva seized every opening with an intelligence that bordered on desperate brilliance, executing combat maneuvers at speeds that pushed the ship's damaged frame to its breaking point, weaving through the home guard formation like a needle through fabric, taking hits that tore away pieces of hull and weapons and engines, but never the core, never the heart of the ship where the crew fought and bled and held on. The battle raged for hours, and the Achilles left a trail of destruction behind it that would be studied and debated for centuries, and with each passing minute, it drew closer to the throne world and the cost grew higher. Crew members died at their stations, killed by power surges and shrapnel and the slow suffocation of compartments losing atmosphere, and those who survived pulled the bodies aside and took their places and kept fighting because there was nothing else to do, because they had come too far to stop, because somewhere behind them were the ghosts of 6,000 people who had come to this empire in peace and had been murdered for it. Captain Mwangi was on the bridge when the forward hull took a direct hit from a concentrated plasma barrage that blew through 3 decks and sent a shockwave through the entire ship. The blast threw him against the navigation console with a force that shattered his left arm and drove fragments of metal into his side, and he lay on the deck in a spreading pool of his own blood, while the bridge burned around him, and Minerva's voice called his name through speakers that crackled with damage. Lieutenant Reeves was at his side in seconds, pulling him away from the wreckage with hands that were already burned and blistered from a fire she had put out on the weapons deck an hour earlier. "Captain, you need to get to medical." "No," Mwangi said, and his voice was tight with pain but absolutely clear. "I am not leaving this bridge. Give me a status report." "We are through the home guard, the throne world is ahead, but the planetary defense grid is fully active and they are charging something. Minerva says it is an energy weapon of a type she has not seen before." Mwangi looked at the tactical display through eyes that were beginning to blur and saw the throne world growing larger, a vast sphere of silver and gold surrounded by rings of defense platforms and weapon satellites. And at its north pole, a structure was glowing with a light so intense that the sensors could barely register it. "That would be the Axiom Lance," Minerva said, her voice carrying something that in a human would have been called fear, an ancient weapon system referenced in imperial historical records as capable of penetrating planetary crusts. It has not been fired in over 9,000 years. It is now aimed at us. Mwangi closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them the pain was still there, but something else was there too, something harder and brighter. "Asha," he said, and it was the first time he had used Reeves's first name in the entire voyage. "Take command of the ship." "Captain." "That is an order, Lieutenant. Take command and put us on a direct approach to the Grand Archive. Not the palace, the archive, that was always the target. Make sure Minerva is ready for the final broadcast." Reeves looked at him and understood, and she did not argue because there was no time, and because he was right, and because she could see in his eyes that he had always known it would end this way. She took the command chair and gripped the controls with burned hands that did not shake. "All stations, this is Lieutenant Reeves assuming command. All power to forward shields. Set course for the Grand Archive. We are going in. The Axiom lance fired. A beam of energy older than most civilizations in the galaxy crossed the distance between the throne world and the Achilles in less than a heartbeat. And it struck the ship with a force that split it apart like a hammer striking glass. The Achilles broke. The aft section disintegrated. The engines and reactor containment and everything behind the midship bulkheads simply ceasing to exist in a flash of white light that blinded sensors across the entire throne nebula. Silence fell. 5,000 warships and 100 defense platforms, and the billions of beings on the throne world below all held their breath in the same instant, staring at the expanding cloud of debris where the human ship had been. And then from the heart of the debris field, a signal. The forward section of the Achilles, a jagged broken piece of hull no larger than a frigate, was still intact, still moving, still falling toward the throne world on the momentum of its final approach, trailing fire and atmosphere and the bodies of the dead. And it was still transmitting. Reeves sat in the shattered remains of the bridge, bleeding from a gash across her forehead, surrounded by the bodies of crew members who had not survived the lance. And she opened every communication channel the ship had left and broadcast on every frequency the Imperium used, her voice raw and breaking, but loud enough to be heard across a civilization. We did not come to conquer. We came so the galaxy would know what you did. You will remember the 6,000. You will remember the Achilles. You will remember. The wreck of the Achilles fell toward the throne world like a burning star, and no one fired another shot, because there was nothing left to shoot at, and because something in that voice had reached through the guns and the shields and the ancient weapons, and touched something that even 12,000 years of empire could not armor against. The truth was coming down, and the Imperium could only watch it fall. The wreck of the UESS Achilles struck the surface of the throne world at dawn, not in the heart of the Imperial Palace as the terrified defense commanders had predicted, but in the great plaza that stood before the Grand Archive, the central repository of every law and record and truth that the Velithi Imperium had ever committed to memory. It came down trailing fire and smoke, and a sound like thunder that shook the foundations of buildings that had stood for millennia, carving a trench through the ancient stone of the plaza, and sending a plume of dust and debris into the golden sky, before finally grinding to a halt less than 100 meters from the archive's towering entrance gates. It had not struck the building. It had never been aimed at the building. Lieutenant Ashay Reeves had guided the wreck with the last functioning maneuvering thrusters the ship possessed, burning her hands on controls that were half-melted and sparking with exposed wiring, steering the dying carcass of the Achilles with a precision that should not have been possible for a vessel that was more debris than ship, and she had put it exactly where Captain Mwangi had told her to put it. Not to destroy but to arrive. Velithi soldiers surrounded the wreckage within minutes, hundreds of warrior priests in gleaming armor with weapons raised, forming a perimeter around the steaming broken hull as emergency crews moved in with cutting tools and atmospheric scanners. They expected resistance. They expected weapons fire and last stands, and the desperate violence of cornered animals. What they found was silence. The forward airlock, the only section of the hull still structurally intact enough to have an airlock, opened with a grinding screech of tortured metal, and Lieutenant Reeves stepped out into the golden light of the throne world's sun. She was burned across her arms and face. Her uniform was torn and stained dark with blood, both hers and others. Her left eye was swollen shut, and she stood with the careful balance of someone who knew that if she fell down, she would not be able to get back up. Behind her, one by one, 47 surviving crew members of the Achilles emerged from the wreckage. 47 out of 1,200. They did not carry weapons. They did not raise their hands in surrender. They simply walked out of their broken ship and stood in the rubble of the plaza and looked at the army that surrounded them with eyes that held no fear and no hatred, only the exhausted calm of people who had done what they came to do. And then Minerva activated her final protocol. The ship's artificial intelligence had survived inside a hardened core deep within the forward section, protected by layers of shielding that had been specifically designed to endure anything up to and including a direct hit from a planetary weapon, because this moment was the reason the Achilles existed. This was the mission, not the battles and not the blockade and not the desperate charge through the home guard, but this, right here, right now. Minerva reached out through the wreckage of the Achilles and connected to the Grand Archive's communication infrastructure, a network so vast and so deeply integrated into the fabric of the Imperium that it touched every inhabited world in every system under Velithi control. And she used that network to transmit a single data package simultaneously to every corner of the galaxy. The package contained everything. The original sealed order, bearing the Emperor's personal seal, commanding the destruction of Earth's diplomatic envoy. The military logs showing the ambush, the 12 human ships surrounded and fired upon without warning, the 6,000 people aboard them who had carried gifts and messages of peace and who had died in the vacuum of space without ever understanding why. The names and faces of every single one of those 6,000 people, compiled from Earth's records, each entry accompanied by a photograph and a brief biography, because the humans had wanted the galaxy to see them not as a number but as individuals, as mothers and fathers and children and scientists and artists and dreamers who had volunteered to cross the stars, because they believed that the universe was full of wonders worth meeting. The cover-up that followed, the sealed files and the silenced witnesses, and the official classification that ensured no one in the Imperium would ever know what had been done in their name. All of it transmitted in every language the Imperium used, formatted for every communication system from the most advanced military networks to the simplest civilian receivers. Impossible to block and impossible to recall and impossible to deny. The truth landed on 12,000 worlds at the speed of light. On the throne world, the reaction was immediate. Citizens who had watched the burning wreck fall from the sky now stood in the streets reading the transmission on their personal devices with expressions of growing horror. And the silence that spread through the capital was worse than any scream. A vast collective intake of breath as an entire civilization realized what its rulers had done. In the imperial court, Emperor Valith XXII sat on the throne that his ancestors had occupied for 12,000 years and watched his empire begin to crack beneath him. Not with weapons, not with armies, not with the brute force that the Imperium understood and could have fought against, but with information, with truth, with the simple, undeniable fact that the most powerful civilization in the galaxy had murdered 6,000 innocent people because it was afraid of what they represented. The crack spread fast. The Nethari conclave, which had been subjugated for 8,000 years, issued a formal demand for an independent investigation and threatened to withdraw all Nethari workers from imperial infrastructure. The Korvathi military conscripts, who made up nearly 15% of the imperial fleet's enlisted personnel, refused to return to duty until the emperor addressed the transmission. 17 species that had been loyal imperial members for centuries sent formal protests to the throne world demanding accountability. The Imperium did not collapse. It was too vast and too old and too deeply rooted to collapse from a single blow. But its mythology collapsed, the story it had told itself and its subjects for 12,000 years, the story of the wise and benevolent god-sovereigns who ruled with justice and protected the weak. That story died in a single morning, and nothing the emperor or his court could say would bring it back. Asha Reeves and the 47 surviving crew members were taken into custody by the Imperial Guard and transported to a holding facility within the palace complex, and it was there that Archivist Tilun Kas found them. He came not as an official representative of the Imperium, but as a private citizen, a scholar who had read the truth before the rest of the galaxy, and who had been carrying its weight for days. And he stood before the holding cells where the battered and exhausted humans sat, and he looked at them with eyes that held something no Velithi had ever directed at a human being before. "Shame. I have read the records," he said, his voice quiet and unsteady. "I know what was done to your people, and I am here to ensure that you are treated as prisoners of war under the interspecies conventions, not as criminals. You have my word, and whatever that word is still worth from a Velithi." Reeves looked at him for a long time, and then she nodded, a small, simple gesture that carried more weight than any words could have. Captain Idris Mwangi died 2 days after the crash. His injuries from the bridge explosion had been too severe, too much blood lost, and too many organs damaged, and the Velithi medical technology that might have saved him was offered too late because the bureaucracy of an empire in crisis moved slowly even when lives hung in the balance. He died in a Velithi medical facility with Lieutenant Reeves holding his hand, and his last words were recorded by Minerva, who was still active in the portable core unit that the crew had carried from the wreckage. "We were never the monsters, we just wanted to come in peace. You chose this." Those words were transmitted to Earth along with the Achilles' final telemetry burst, a data package that Minerva had sent in the moment before impact containing all sensor recordings, all battle data, and a 2-word status update that was received by the United Earth Stellar Navy's Deep Space Communications Array 14 days later. Message delivered. Earth mourned and then Earth built. The construction yards above Luna and Mars and Europa, which had produced the Achilles in secret over 4 years, began work on new ships, not 1 but 100, and then 200 and then more, vessels designed not for a suicide mission but for deterrence, for the simple and unmistakable message that humanity would never again be quiet enough to be ignored, and never again be vulnerable enough to be silenced. Archivist Tillun dedicated the remainder of his life to advocating for human integration into the galactic community, using the weight of the truth he had uncovered to push for reforms that the Imperium resisted at every step, but could no longer refuse outright because the galaxy was watching now, and the galaxy remembered. 3 centuries later, a historian stood in the plaza before the Grand Archive on the Throne World and looked up at the monument that rose from the place where the Achilles had come to rest. The wreck had been preserved exactly as it had landed, a twisted cathedral of scorched metal and blackened armor plate standing in the heart of the most powerful empire in the galaxy, surrounded by gardens that the Nethari had planted and that the Korvathi maintained, and that beings from 100 different species visited every day to stand in silence and remember. A plaque at the base of the wreck bore an inscription in every language the Imperium used, and in one language it did not, a language called English that came from a small blue world on the edge of the periphery. Here fell the UESS Achilles and her crew of 1,200 souls, of whom 1,153 gave their lives, so that the galaxy would hear the names of 6,000 who were silenced. Let this stand as proof that there is no empire so vast that truth cannot reach its heart. The historian closed his notes and stood for a long time looking at the monument with the golden light of the throne world sun warming his silver skin. He was Velithi. He was ashamed. And he was grateful, because 300 years ago a species that his empire had tried to erase had crossed the entire galaxy in a single broken ship to deliver a message that could not be silenced. And that message had not been a declaration of war or a demand for vengeance, but something far more powerful and far more human. Remember us. Remember what was done. And never let it happen again. The historian bowed his head before the monument, and then he walked away into the golden light, carrying the story with him, as billions of beings across the galaxy carried it with them. A story that had begun with a single sensor ping on a forgotten monitoring station, and had ended with a truth so loud that it echoed across the stars. Humanity had come to the Imperium not to destroy it, but to make it better, and they had paid for that choice with everything they had. And the galaxy finally remembered.